Hello, friend, and welcome to Peaceful Narrator, a place where imagination comes alive through stories told with warmth and calm. Here, every tale invites you to slow down, listen, and feel the world within the words. If you enjoy these moments of peace, consider liking and subscribing so you won't miss a story. There are no ads in the middle or at the end, so you can relax completely. So settle in, let your mind wander, and enjoy the journey. Now, the story begins. The Hidden Garden. By the time the traveler reached the old lane, afternoon was fading into the slow, golden envelope of evening. Their feet were light with dust, their shoulders pleasantly warmed, and the day had gone by in a string of quiet impressions. Trees whispering, a brook folding over stones, the scent of clean earth rising after a distant rain earlier in the morning. They carried little: a rolled cloak, a pouch with a small knife and a wooden spoon, a flask of water. The lane had once been paved with rounded stones, and though moss had softened many edges, each step still felt steady. The traveler enjoyed the rhythm of it, the way it placed their thoughts in a row and hushed them, the way soft sunlight filtered through branches that met overhead, weaving shadows that moved across their path like fish moving through clear water. They did not plan to stop for long, only to pause and look, as they always did when passing between old hedgerows. The hedges spoke of hands that had clipped them once, hands that had guided their shape. The traveler liked that sort of remembering, and they liked the way such places seemed to invite an unhurried curiosity. So when they saw the gap in the hedge, almost entirely hidden by blackberry canes and the arch of honeysuckle, they went closer. It hardly looked like a doorway at first, but it had a way of organizing itself into one if you knew how to look. Not a rectangle or a gate, not even an arch, just a suggestion that the hedge had once been trained aside to make room for passage. A few pale bones of willow wove through the greenery like the remains of a trellis that had been forgotten. The traveler paused there. The honeysuckle lifted its sweetness, and bees murmured. The air was warmer on this side of the lane, as if the hedge had caught sunlight and kept it for later. They eased the blackberry cane aside with the back of their hand, careful of thorns, and ducked in. On the other side, the world opened into a pocket of quiet. Old stones ringed the edges of a space that had once been a small garden and was now a soft tangle of green. It was as if someone had cupped their hands around a portion of land and said, gently, "Rest." The traveler stood and breathed in. Dry herbs and damp earth, wild mint and something lemon bright. A low wall of moss-lined rubble protected one side. On another, a half-fallen fence leaned into tall meadow grasses, and the grasses leaned back as if to keep it company. The traveler felt the desire to sit down and rest in the way one feels the presence of deep water during a hot day, a sensation fragile and complete. They made no immediate move. A wren regarded them from the broken crease of a clay pot. A butterfly, fragile as skin, dipped and lifted in a steady pulse over a cluster of blue flowers that had seated themselves there in a mat of leaves. A bee bumped the lip of a rusted watering can and found its way to a small bloom whose petals had gone slightly translucent in the light. The traveler took a few slow steps and then crouched, their fingertips brushing the finely serrated leaf of a plant whose scent made its name clear: lemon balm. Close beside it grew thyme, low and persistent, with tiny purple vessels of blossom that hummed with tiny visitors. In a corner stood a rosemary bush, woody and patient, its blue flowers, like sky, caught in shade. "Hello," the traveler said, because the garden had that feeling, that it should be greeted as one would greet a friend you haven't seen in a long time. The wren tilted its head and did not fly. The traveler smiled and sat back on their heels. The garden was not abandoned exactly. It had been left alone, which is not the same as forgotten. Plants had grown less in lines than in drift, finding their own shapes in the softness. Between them, 100 small lives threaded, a snail shining faintly as it considered the undersides of leaves, a folded green grasshopper like a leaf itself, the quiet movement of spiders stringing fine bridges between stems. They stood and walked along what might have been a path, if one had squinted. The traveler didn't mind the way all things blurred into nearby things. They loved meandering trails and did not require them to commit to anywhere in particular. Under their hand, the rosemary's needles gave off a smell that seemed to fall out of the air and come back to it, pine sweet, sea bright, anchored to the sun. By the leaning fence, a patch of sage had grown into low shrubs, its soft, gray-green leaves inviting to the touch. When the traveler brushed them with the back of their fingers, the scent rose warm and savory, as if fire and hearth might spontaneously assemble around them. A shallow stone basin lay nestled under a lilac that had grown tall and formed an umbrella of green. The basin might once have been a bird bath. Now it held rainwater and a long strand of algae like a curled green ribbon. The traveler crouched to see. A small chorus of tiny water-skipping insects took the measure of them and then continued skating without worry. They could see the clouds reflected there, drifting in loose formations, and for a moment felt the odd pleasure of looking both down and up at the sky at once. There was a place here for a traveler to sit and a place to be still. A flat rock, warm through, settled along the inner curve of the wall. The travelers set down their pack and eased themselves onto the stone, which gave back its stored heat with a kind of generosity that made the traveler feel drowsy. The hum of bees formed a braid with the breeze and the soft chittering of the wren, and that braid tied itself around their senses in an almost visible spiral. When they closed their eyes, sun fell soft as linen across their face and shoulders. They felt the slight tug of a smile and let the weight of their head tilt to one side. They would stay for a while. There was no need to measure it. Time in the garden worked differently. It did not hurry, and it did not stop. It expanded like breath. The traveler noticed small things before larger ones, or perhaps larger ones became small by their noticing. There was a tiny ecosystem here that had all the completeness of a larger one. All the necessary parts glided into place and held each other up. When the traveler opened their eyes again, the light had shifted. A shadow had stretched across their knees, and in that shadow, a few tiny clover flowers had lifted their pale purple heads and opened to drink the cooler part of the day. The travelers stood, unrolling their shoulders and feeling the slow slide of pleasant fatigue. They looked at the garden and looked a little beyond it. A low gate, made of smooth branches, lashed together long ago, lay half-hidden under a spill of wild roses. The roses were past their heaviest bloom, but here and there a pale blossom still opened, and the air retained a faint sweetness that held in it the memory of stronger days. The traveler went and knelt by the gate. One hinge had rusted in a gentling way. The other had given itself up entirely, and the gate rested on the earth like a sleeping dog. The traveler brushed soil from the wood. "I could lift you onto the stones," they told it, as though it required persuasion. "Just so the plants can keep their room." They tried a shoulder under the gate and found it lighter than it looked. That particular form of robust fragility that old wood has. Seasoned, not brittle. They lifted carefully and propped it against the low wall where it could lean with dignity. As they did, they saw a small scatter of terracotta fragments, parts of pots that had once held something loved. They touched the edge of a curved piece and thought of hands pressing into warm soil, and of mornings when the air was still damp and everything felt possible in a quiet way. In the corner near the rosemary bush, a small pile of weathered stakes lay along the ground. The traveler picked one up and turned it in their hand. The top was rounded and worn smooth, as if many fingers had used it to label rows. There was a faint ghost of writing on it, almost relieved into the wood, though the ink had gone. They wondered what had once grown here, in tidy succession. Parsley and dill, perhaps. Chives, whose purple puffs could hide among grasses and still somehow be their own kind of celebration. They smiled and returned the steak to the others, and decided, without deciding, to spend a little time tending. Not much, just what the garden might accept without feeling changed by it. They fetched the rusted watering can and tilted it. Water sloshed, a clear and encouraging sound. The spout gave it up in a gentle sprinkle, few and fat drops that fell in a pattern like a soft drum. The traveler brought it to the lemon balm and thyme and gave them a drink, then to the sage and rosemary. The earth drank with a slight darkening, light specks disappearing into richness. They saved some water for the basin, pouring a little along the rim and watching it merge, the surface tension quivering. In the ripples, the sky trembled and then stilled, and a single strand of hair fell across the traveler's face and tickled their cheek with a feeling that reminded them of being younger and having the patience to lie in grass and watch ants take their steps. There was a patch of soil that had taken on a matted felt of dead stems and old leaves. The traveler knelt and teased it apart with their fingers, lifting the dry, weightless layer and making a small space for air to go through. The scent that rose was clean and sweet, like the inside of new bread. Under that mat, a few pale shoots that had been trying to find their way into light were suddenly offered an easy path. The traveler smoothed the loosened soil around them, not pressing, simply arranging it. "Good," they said, and the word felt almost too loud in the air, so they spoke the next one more softly. There, the sun slid down another degree. Light moved along leaves with an almost touchable slowness, and the herb leaves threw little shadows onto themselves, as if they were layering their own shade for safekeeping. The traveler stretched their legs and stood, feeling the slight pull behind their knees, and turned in place to take in the whole garden. They could see now that its shape was a simple rectangle with rounded corners, likely marked out by some careful person long ago. A quince tree leaned toward the center, as if wanting to listen to everything. Its leaves were smooth and round, and where the light moved through them, it turned the green to a translucent apple lime. It had a few fruits on it already, small and fuzzy, and the traveler imagined what it would feel like when they grew heavy and the tree had to share its strength. They thought about stewed quince with honey, about the caramel edges a pan of such fruit would develop over a slow fire. It was almost too rich a thought for such a moment, and when it became too vivid, they let it go, allowing the taste to dissolve back into the mild air. And somebody had built a bench under the quince tree once. It had gone moss-soft along its top and leaned a little, but held. The traveler brushed it off with their sleeve and sat. The garden returned to its small sounds around them. A snail made progress along the wet rim of a clay shard. The wren moved with efficient hops, sifting the undersides of leaves for whatever small bits of luck they might offer. Overhead, a few clouds gathered their skirts toward the horizon, and the edge of the visible world deepened from pale to gold to that clear kind of blue that feels like a song finishing. The traveler reached into their pouch and brought out a heel of bread they had saved from lunchtime. It had kept its crust well. They broke it into pieces and ate slowly, chewing deliberately, letting their jaw move in an unhurried way. A few bites, they broke a small crumb and laid it on the edge of the stone near the bench. Not a bribe, not bait, just a piece of kindness left where it might be found by someone other than themselves. Whether or not it was found, the intention itself seemed to fit the day. As dusk edged closer, the traveler felt a simple question arrive. Would you like to stay here for the night? It wasn't a voice nor a decision, only a suggestion drawn by the shape of the place and the ease in their limbs. They had meant to go farther, perhaps to the inn near the bend in the road, where salmon were smoked on good days and the innkeeper's daughter brought baked apples to tables by lamplight. But the idea of staying in the garden did not compete with that. It felt like a different kind of comfort, thinner and lighter, and no less satisfying. They pulled their cloak from their pack and unrolled it on the bench, then, after a pause, spread it on the ground instead, and plumped their pack into a makeshift pillow. They took a sip from their flask, and then poured a little water into their cupped hand and let it fall back, enjoying the coolness. The air had turned from day warm to evening soft, and a delicate hush settled over everything. The scent of the herbs lifted again as the temperature dropped, as if they breathed at night as we do. Somewhere a night insect began to call, a single tone as pure as water, repeating in slow intervals that marked time more kindly than any clock. The traveler lay down and rolled to one side, their hand tucked under their cheek. From that angle, the garden looked different, as familiar things do when seen from a new level. Stems became trees. The edges of leaves became boundaries, sheltering whole worlds. An ant, carrying something that looked like a seed, crossed a folded leaf with careful bravado. The traveler watched the ant find its way around an unexpected gap and felt oddly reassured by its competence. Above, the quince leaves trembled slightly in the faint breeze, and the sky softened as stars revealed themselves in a patient order. Sleep came as it comes to travelers who have walked just the right distance and then found a place to rest, slowly, without ceasing, like a tide rising to meet the shore. Before the last bit of wakefulness went, the traveler heard the wren one more time, a small, bright song that seemed to stamp a seal on the day. As though everything had happened exactly as it should. They let go into that certainty. Morning woke the garden in layers, as if someone brought in bowls of light one at a time and set them gently onto the table of the world. The traveler woke with it, their cheek cool against the cloak, their shoulders pleased at the ease they had had. Dew had beaded along thin stems and caught in webs, and the beads lifted the early light the way Kai glass does, diffusing it and turning it into something that could be felt as well as seen. Birdsong was different in the morning, more talkative, less secret. The wren had neighbors whose voices the traveler had not heard the day before, and they took a moment to listen for each one, to track where it came from and where it likely went. They sat up and wrapped the cloak around their shoulders. The garden had that soft chill that means all the heat has not yet climbed from the inside of the earth to the air. The traveler's breath showed briefly, then whisked into nothing. They stood, stretched, and took a slow walk along the border of the garden to see it in its morning clothes. The sage seemed grayer, the rosemary a cooler green. Lemon balm seasons lent their citrus into a new shape, as if a pearl of dew could taste like lemon when touched. A patch of low-seeded dill surprised the traveler with its delicate umbrella heads lifting above fine thread leaves. They hadn't noticed them the day before. And now the morning had found them and handed them to view. They held out a hand under one umbrella head and watched a dew bead spill into their palm. A tiny frog, the size of a coin, leaped from the stone basin's rim into the water with a plink, then drifted to the surface, entirely unafraid and small, like a drop of the basin itself. The traveler leaned closer, smiled at it, and the frog seemed to smile back in the loose way of frogs, then wriggled toward the shade beneath a waterweed. The traveler ate a little from their pack, a few dried apricots and some nuts, then stood and looked at the garden as if it were a letter they were reading again. The sense of wanting to tend returned, not as a responsibility, but as a pleasure. It felt like that lazy sort of morning when one is not compelled to do anything, and so everything done becomes a choice that carries its own interest. They found a patch of nettle near the wall. Not much, plenty for butterflies, but threatening to crowd a small tuft of chives that had managed to assert themselves with brave green blades. The traveler went and cut a length of the old willow that had grown across the entrance and used it to push the nettles gently aside, giving the chives a little room and themselves a moiety of distance from the nettle's sting. The willow, when cut, had a sweet, green smell, as of new rain. Next, they found the garden fork, its tines dulled and brown, living in the shadow under the bench, as if it had returned there faithfully after a day's work and then forgotten itself. They rested their palm against its handle. It felt drier than they would have liked, but still strong. They drove it into the soil near the rosemary and lifted the earth in small, deliberate arcs, letting air thread through. The earth fell back in clumps that broke on contact, and each break made a slight sound, like a sigh. There were no big stones. Those had been removed, long ago, by patient hands who had walked the garden in circles, plucking trouble by the piece and setting it aside to rim the wall. The traveler admired the gentleness of that solution, not to banish what is in the way, but to lift it and build with it a boundary that defines where things go. The morning became mid-morning. Sun warmed their back, and then their shoulders, and then their neck, where they pushed hair away. They removed their cloak and draped it across the bench, knowing that later it would smell of time and sun. They tied their hair back with a length of twine from their pack and continued to work in small doses, not too much. They had no desire to impose order on a place that had found its own easy heartbeat. They only wanted to make room for what was already there to breathe more openly. A neighborly voice arrived at the edge of hearing, not human, not precisely animal either, but something like the sound of wind finding and going through threads of a woven thing. For a moment, the traveler wondered if there were bees nesting in the stone wall. Their hum seemed to have an origin there, and when the traveler went to look, they thought they could see, in a gap between two stones, a smooth roundness that might be old wax. They felt delighted, and they felt the appropriate distance from that too. If bees had made their house there, then this garden was theirs as much as anyone's, and the traveler would move with the care one keeps in the rooms of another. They watered with what remained in the can, and then walked to the edge of the hedge to refill it at the brook. The path to the brook was narrow but comfortable, a trellis of limbs overhead. The ground firm. The brook itself was the sort that is happy in its smallness. Its voice was quick and made of tinier parts, a choir of running, chuckling notes. The traveler dipped the can into a stiller pool and watched the swirl come up as the water rushed in. They paused with the can heavy in their hand and turned to see how the lane looked from this side. It was different, untold, as all familiar things are when seen from someplace new. They liked that. They liked knowing that they could go out and walk and return, but that here they could also stay and see the world come to them. Back in the garden, the can's mouth made a scatter of pearls on the leaves. A springtail drifted atop one, like a sailor on a soft sea. The traveler knelt by the rosemary again and crumbled its aromas between fingers into the air. Then thought to gather a few leaves, not to take away, only to put into the basin for the sake of their scent and their soft motion in water. They picked a few sprigs with care and set them afloat like green boats. A bee landed on one of the sprigs, drank from a droplet, and lifted off again, an event simple and satisfying, the sort of note that affirms an overture. As shadows shortened and then lengthened, the traveler became part of the garden's daily pace. They learned the difficult spots, where a vine would trip a foot if they did not step high. They learned how many breaths it took to walk from the rosemary to the quince tree, and how many to turn and cross to the lilac. They learned the angle of light on the sage at noon, and how that angle changed in late afternoon. And they found pleasure in that noticing, in the way one takes pleasure in returning to a well-known word and speaking it again, savoring the way it fits in the mouth. Often, they sat on the bench and just watched. It felt like tending, too. Who could say that being a witness to the lives of small things was not itself a form of care? The snail lifted its horns and then pulled them in. The grasshopper bowed its back and then sprang, moving from one stem to another with absurd grace. A ladybird stumbled through a cluster of thyme blossoms and cleaned its feet, one after the other, slowly and thoroughly, like a person offering thanks before eating. The traveler's breath fell into quiet rhythm with these tiny schedules. Their backs softened. A little knot that had lived near their shoulder blade for weeks unknotted itself without fanfare. The worry that had kept its small perch behind the traveler's eyes simply got bored and wandered away to find something else to perch on. Around the middle of the day, the traveler heard a voice in their own chest that sounded like the desire to give something back. "What would you like?" the traveler asked the garden, not expecting an answer, but ready for one. They looked around and saw a patch where the soil was bare and pale, a little neglected corner near the low gate. It did not seem under strain. It seemed like a pause in the garden's language. The traveler looked in their pack and found a few packets of seeds they had been carrying without any particular plan. Some herbs, some flowers, a small handful of peas that could climb if given the chance. They had bought these at a market from an old woman who sold them from jars and paper envelopes, who had smiled and tucked an extra small packet into the traveler's hand without bothering to say what it was. It felt right to try. The traveler knelt and brushed the pale soil with their fingers, loosening it until it felt like coarse sugar between their hands. They opened the envelope of peas and dropped 3 into their palm. They were greenish, puckered, and perfect. They widened the path of clear soil and set the peas in, not too deep, a thumb's depth perhaps, and tamped the soil over them with a soft fist. They took a few small branches from the "It was once a gate" and pushed them into the earth near where the peas would grow, a miniature trellis, a suggestion to climb. Next, they opened the packet with morning-friendly flowers, calendula, bright as coin suns, borage, starry and blue, beloved of bees, and the secret packet, which contained seeds like tiny commas, curved and black. They did not know what they were. That was part of the pleasure. Seeds are the body's way of telling time slowly, of making promises that cannot be rushed. The traveler scattered them lightly with holdings in their hand, letting them fall where they would, and then brushed a fine layer of soil over them. In a few places they arranged a small nest, hollowing a thumbprint and dropping a single seed in as if tucking it to sleep. Then they watered the patch, careful not to dislodge what they had buried. "I'll see you again," they said, "and if I don't, someone will." Both versions felt true to them. Something in the garden, breeze or leaf, or simply the pleasure of saying the words, answered with a lift that to the traveler felt like a scent. The day took its rest in late afternoon, the way good days do, not fading so much as reclining. The traveler, too, took a rest. They lay along the cloak under the quince and let the filter of its leaves turn sunlight into a green shade, cool as water. Their mind went quiet. They watched ants and clouds the way a person listens to a friend read aloud. They dozed and woke, and dozed and woke, the border between the two states not sharp at all. When they stood, they did it leisurely, and felt the welcome weight of their body settle back into itself. As the sun lowered toward the rim of the world, the air gathered the day's warmth and held it lightly. The traveler thought about evening, about where to be. A thought came to them like a small piece of song. The idea of steeping a cup of tea with herbs taken from the garden. The idea seemed both kindly and fit. They stood and took a handful of lemon balm, a sprig or two of thyme, and one small rosemary tip. They crushed them gently in their hands and put them into their tin cup, then poured warm water from a little kettle they carried, which they filled from the brook and warmed over a few coals gathered carefully, mindful of leaving no trace. They let the herbs steep until the water turned faintly greenish and the steam carried the garden backward to them. They drank slowly, using both hands to hold the cup so that the warmth did not escape prematurely into the cooling air. The taste was clear and complex, like a story told by someone whose voice you could listen to for a long time. The lemon was bright, without being sharp, the thyme grounding, the rosemary almost an afterthought, arriving late and staying a little. The tea softened their chest and behind their ribs, and they felt gratitude that did not require any object. It was gratitude itself, a warm current that has its own direction and does not ask for the naming of a reason. With their cup in their hands, the traveler walked again to the low wall and looked out past the garden. Beyond the hedge, the lane continued east and west. Past the lane, a field rolled up to a small copse, and beyond that, hills yawned and lifted themselves against the sky. The edges of things fell gently, waiting for night. The traveler felt content to be in this small place within the bigger places, like a drop of water within a sea, going where the sea goes, and yet also at rest in itself. Evening deepened. Somewhere, owls woke and spoke their soft syllables to each other. The wren tucked its small self into a safe cleft. The traveler lay down again and curled on their side. They pulled their cloak over their shoulders, then over their hips, their knees, their feet. Their toes found the warmth left in the earth, and they made a little nest for them there. They put their cheek into the crook of their arm, and the smell of wool and thyme made them feel very much in the right place. They thought, as one does before sleep, of where they had been and where they might go. They had seen many towns and many fields. They had slept under a few roofs and under many skies. They had spoken to many people and spent good hours alone. All along, they had wondered what sort of home might be theirs. They had thought perhaps none, or perhaps many little ones. In this garden, they did not find a conclusion, only a space that made the question quieter and turned it into something else. What sort of care might they offer to themselves and to places like this, wherever they found them? It was not a question with an answer in words. It was a question whose answer was in gestures. Watering a plant, moving a gate, gathering a few seeds and letting them back into the soil. It was a question answered by notice and by the slow ritual of being present. They slept easy. Stars breathed overhead, their light old and patient. A coolness passed and then lifted. In dreams, the traveler saw their hands pressed into soil the way hands cup water, and they felt the good weight of it. Morning again. This time, the traveler woke to a scent of mint and a faint sound of footsteps on the lane. They did not stir, only listened. The steps kept going. A cart passed, the wheels making a wooden undersong that came with the rhythm of an animal's hooves, and then it too went on. The garden had not been discovered. It had simply gone unnoticed, as hidden things do when they are meant to keep their quietness for those who look sideways. The traveler rose and walked to the little patch where they had planted the peas and the starry flowers and the unknown seeds. It was too early for anything to show, of course, and yet when the traveler looked, they felt the ease of a promise. Some small shift in the soil's surface, the faintest uplift where a pea might push. They smiled at their own hope, at the human pleasure of believing in something before evidence arrives. Then they set to the day's small tasks. They repaired the hinge on the gate as best they could, using a loop of twine and a little ingenuity. They reinforced where the willow had once held together the old trellis and made it hold again, not so tightly that the rose would feel constrained, not so loosely that it would tear against itself. They brushed off the bench more thoroughly, and while doing so, they sang a little, one of those songs that has no words and repeats itself without feeling repetitive, the melody adjusting itself like a well-trained vine to wherever the breath goes. The garden listened the way it listens to sunlight, accepting the song and letting it melt in. Later, they walked to the brook again and bathed their hands and face. Water had that special, particular cold that wakes but does not startle. They watched a fish as small as a finger smudge dart into shade under a stone. A dragonfly came and hung in the air, looking at the traveler with its many-faceted eyes, as if considering whether to land. It did, for a moment, on the traveler's sleeve, its body warmer than one would think, a little weight that delighted the traveler, and then it lifted and went. Everywhere, life moved at its own pace, some so fast the traveler could barely follow, some so slow they had to be still for a very long time to notice it at all. They decided they had time for both. Days passed in this manner. 2, perhaps 3. It is hard to count days when the point of them is not to count. The traveler made a small rhythm. In morning they watered and opened the garden's breath by loosening soil here and there. In afternoon, they sat or lay and watched, sometimes dozing, sometimes thinking with their eyes open, which felt very different from the thinking they had done in other parts of their life. In the evenings, they drank tea made of what the garden offered, and let night tuck around them with the ease of a friend's arm placed lightly around a shoulder. They began to feel as if the garden and they had an understanding. It was a wordless thing, like what one builds with a gentle dog or a shy child. A basic trust, a respect for the other's ways. Once on the second evening, the traveler murmured, "I don't know how long I'll stay." As though in response, a single white moth appeared and fluttered in that soft, erratic pattern that is its own. It made circles, then smaller circles, then drifted toward the rosemary and hung. And for a moment, in the dim light, the white of the moth seemed to be the white of the rosemary blossom, and the two looked like versions of each other. The traveler took that as an answer. Stay as long as what you are matches what is here. Then go on with that same matching inside you. The seeds slept. On the morning of the third day, the traveler noticed a tiny green elbow, curved like a comma, pushing up through the soil. They squatted beside it and watched, doing nothing, not touching, only witnessing the small triumph. They felt a pride that felt misplaced and yet unavoidable. The way one feels happiness when rain finally arrives and you had nothing to do with bringing it. They imagined that later, the seedling would break the soil's thin skin all the way and open itself and begin its climb. They believed in that and found that the believing made them warm. At midday, the traveler heard a voice at the gap in the hedge that is not a gate, but is one. Hello? The voice was hesitant, curious. It belonged to a person whose steps were light and who waited between each step as if to listen to a call and response in the world. The traveler looked up, not surprised. They had known, perhaps, that if they had found the garden, someone else might too. They stood. The person who stepped in wore a woven basket over their arm and had hair braided into a simple rope. They looked at the traveler and then at the garden with that same feeling of being greeted by something one had already loved. "Oh," the new person said, the sound expanding to take in all the green. "I thought it might still be here." Their face softened. "I used to come when I was very young with my grandmother. We would bring a trowel and a cup and we would talk to the plants. I thought maybe I had imagined it." The traveler felt the pleasure of this coincidence. They nodded. "It is here," they said, "and it remembers you, I think." The person laughed quietly, an amused little breath. "You've tended a bit," they said, their eye going to the patch near the gate, the loosened soil, the gentle trellis. They crouched and touched the dirt with a familiarity that made the traveler feel relieved. "Those were her stakes," they added, nodding toward the old smooth-topped wooden markers. "We wrote on them in pencil, because ink washes with rain." They picked one up and smiled at its faint lines. "She said if you write it in pencil, time will read it even if people can't." The traveler liked that very much. They watched the person touch the rosemary, the sage, and the lemon balm with an ease that the traveler recognized. The garden made a different sort of ease around them, as if a small piece of an old pattern, set aside, had been put back in place. "Will you take anything?" the traveler asked, gesturing to the basket. The person shook their head, smiling. "Only what we always took," they said. "Memory and a few cuttings." They snipped a small tip of rosemary and a few leaves of sage and laid them in the basket with care. "What about you?" they asked, meeting the traveler's eyes in the warm way of someone who has stored kindness and wants to spend it. "I will take what you take," the traveler said after a moment, "and I will leave a little more of myself here." The person nodded, as though this made perfect sense. They sat on the bench with the traveler and watched a ladybird climb the stem of a dill like a pilgrim going through a gentle country. "She was a kind person," the visitor said, of their grandmother. "She always said a garden is a letter you write to your future self, and also to strangers." They smiled again. She would have been happy to know someone found it and let it breathe. They talked a little more. The visitor told stories about the garden, how there once had been marigolds making a bright border that kept some pests away simply by smelling strongly, how there had been a patch of strawberries, small and precise, intensely sweet, how one year the quince had given so much that they had brought baskets to neighbors and baked and stewed, and there was still more, so that jars filled shelves like little suns. They spoke with a softness that made each image sit comfortably in the traveler's mind, like small stones placed into the lap of a river, and then smoothed there by time. When it was time to go, because people do go, in gardens as in the lanes of life, the visitor stood and looked around as if to draw the garden into themselves one more time. "Thank you," they said to the traveler, and more quietly, to the garden too, because it was the right thing to do. "I will come back in a week, perhaps, with a bit of oil for the hinges and a new spool of twine, and perhaps we will bring a child if she is not fussy that day." The traveler felt happy at the idea. "There will be peas by then," they said, and they both smiled knowingly at the charming overstatement of that. After the visitor left, the garden did not feel emptier. It felt more continuous. like a stream that had been joined by another, and simply kept going. The traveler spent the rest of that day in the kind of peaceful energy that comes from having been connected to a past and a future in one conversation. It made their current moment rich without making it heavy. In the evening, a light rain came. It moved across the garden the way a kind hand moves across a brow. The traveler sat under the quince and watched the droplets catch on leaves and gather, then fall. The basil-like smell of damp thyme rose in a way that, once smelled, would always be remembered. The rain washed dust from leaves and brightened green to something beyond green. The traveler laughed once, a small chuckle at the way a big drop, gathered from 3 small ones, surprised a rosemary flower by its weight and bounced it, like the gentle tapping of a finger on a friend's shoulder. The sound of rain becomes a kind of room when one listens to it. It makes walls and a roof out of its steady pattern. The traveler found themselves protected by it in a way that made their breathing come slower. Each inhale, smelling clean. Each exhale, tasting faintly of mint. Dusk came early because of the rain, and the traveler lay down earlier than usual. The cloak held the damp at bay. They pulled it up to their chin and gazed toward the hedgerow, where beads of water hung like small lanterns. Fireflies stitched light above the wet grass, their flash unreadable and essential. They felt gratitude once more, not for any one thing, but for the way the world sometimes arranges itself into a kind of quiet that holds, a quiet one can feel in the bones. They went to sleep thinking of seeds the way one might think of small boats preparing for a journey, not anxious for their departure, certain of their ability to go in time. On the morning that followed the rain, the earth was thick with scent and feeling. Mushrooms had popped open along the shady side of the wall, pale coins adding their own geometry. The peas had, miraculously, grown a fingertip's worth and had unfurled a first true leaf that held a drop of the night's rain at its center, a tiny lens through which the traveler could see the world inverted and turned upright again. The traveler admired that. It felt like a miniature experiment in perspective offered up by the plant without commentary. They took a slow walk. It was the sort of morning that feels like an offered gift, and the traveler received it the way one receives any gift given freely, with open hands and a promise to use it well. They thought about the road waiting beyond the hedge. They thought about the people they would meet, and the meals they would eat, and the rivers they would cross. They thought, too, about the invisible threads that tie places together, the ways an herb patch in one town and an herb patch in another can teach a person about continuity. They knew now that this garden would be one of the places they carried with them, a sort of portable room inside that they could open when they needed the smell of rosemary and the touch of thyme and the sight of a wren in the quiet concavity of a broken pot. They packed their things when the sun had risen a little higher, moving lazily, the opposite of a hurry. They folded the cloak in half and then half again, shaking it once to release seed heads that had clung to it. They watched them scatter and fall and felt a small child's happiness about giving chance one more chance. They coiled the twine and set it on the bench, ready for future hands. They wiped the knife and spoon, tied them into the pouch, and took one last drink of water from the flask. Then they walked along the garden's length one more time, their fingers trailing lightly over the tips of the rosemary obliging with a scent that said to memory, Now is the time. They touched the sage. They pressed their palm into lemon balm, and then to their cheek. They leaned near the patch where the peas pushed and whispered, "Grow well." It felt important to them that this permission be spoken aloud. "You will come again?" asked something in them. Not a demand, a curiosity. "I will," they answered themselves gently. "And if I do not, someone will. And in the meantime, you will have what you need." They believed it. They thought of the visitor with the basket, of the child perhaps, of the bees with their home in the wall, of the wren, of the frog in the basin. They thought of the rain and the sun and the slow conductor of time, keeping things in their places without the need for a baton. They stepped through the gap in the hedge and back onto the lane. The world felt both different and the same. That paradox pleased them. They turned once in the doorway that is not a doorway and looked back. The garden's light fell partway into shadow and partway into sun, a mixture that felt exactly right in the cool of the day. They lifted a hand. There was no one to see the gesture, but it had its own effect. They felt the garden's permission to carry it with them, and the garden's comfortable indifference to being carried. It would be there whether they carried it or not. And that stability made them feel like a person who could choose to remember or choose not to, and both choices would be correct. They began to walk along the lane. The stones underfoot seemed a little more rounded, as if, in the time they had been still, the lane had continued its own weathering and had, in a small way, softened. The traveler did not hurry. They allowed their head to turn now and then, taking in the hedgerows and the way light caught in cobwebs, the distant suggestion of a town, the smell of wood smoke that means someone else is making a meal they will enjoy. They were at peace with the pace of their footsteps, and they liked that their body felt a little stronger from the small work of tending. Their shoulders moved easily. Their hands were roughened in a grateful way. They felt as if they had tamped some of their inner soil and also loosened some of it, making space for unknown seeds to germinate. As they walked, they found themselves thinking not of leaving, but of continuing, which is a different feeling. They thought of other forgotten gardens they might find, and of how forgotten is a misnamed thing, because places remember themselves even when people do not. They thought of how they could make it a practice to carry a small packet of seeds and a roll of twine and a knife that fits well in the hand, and offer those to places in exchange for the gifts places offer to them: shade, time-scented air, the sight of an ant negotiating a petal, the serenity that comes from understanding that the world can manage itself if given room. A little while later, when the lane joined a wider path, and that path led to an inn with a signboard shaped like a fish and a window full of a warm glow, the traveler turned in. They would eat and sleep in a bed that night. That, too, was a kindness. The innkeeper's daughter did indeed bring baked apples to tables by lamplight, and the traveler found that the taste of time in their memory made the apples taste even sweeter. Between bites, they wrote a few lines in their notebook, lines that would not be a confession or a lesson, simply a record. They drew a little map, a square with rounded corners, a low wall, a quince inside and a bench, a mark for the rosemary and for the basin, and a small star for the patch by the gate where the peas and the stars and the unknown slept. They slept under a roof and dreamt of no specific thing, only of green, and of soft light, and of the sound a snail makes when it slides over wet stone. They woke rested and ready to go on. They had added nothing large to their life, and had lost nothing. And yet, some inner corner had been straightened, as one straightens a tablecloth before setting a bowl upon it. Weeks passed. The traveler walked elsewhere, tending here and there as they found, moving through days that made a pattern when seen from above. They sometimes reached into their pocket during a conversation, as if touching the seeds there could help them answer someone with more patience. They marked in their notebook the places where they had planted a small cluster of herbs, and the places where they had found a bird's nest, empty and blue with its remembered eggshells, and the places where they had slept under a tree whose leaves were kind. They were a person who could rest. They were a person who could move. Both truths complemented each other like colors side by side. Eventually, their path looped back. It was an accident only in the way the body sometimes takes you where you need to go without telling the mind about it. They found themselves on the old lane in the late afternoon, with the world once again clothed in gold that softened edges rather than sharpening them. As they walked, something in them recognized the exact angle of a stone, the way a wayward branch reached like a generous hand. They saw the gap in the hedge and felt, with the relief of a sigh one didn't know one was holding, joy. They pushed aside the honeysuckle and ducked in. The garden was as it had been, and also different. In their absence, small changes had taken place in the gentle forward lilt of growing things. The peas had sent up vines that had found the little trellis and had wrapped themselves in elegant spirals, then more, and now small flowers like white moths hung from them. And near those flowers, the earliest pods had formed, thin and tender, like green capsules of promise made visible. The calendula made little suns at the edge of the patch, and a bee smudged blue with borage dust made its rounds. The traveler laughed, softly, not for the purposes of waking or startling, but for the sake of acknowledging how pleasant it is when hope addresses itself and then answers with a visible reply. There was a length of twine on the bench, neat and new. The hinge on the gate no longer asked for rescue when the traveler opened it. It moved not silently, but contentedly, with that low wooden sound that says, "I work." Among the rosemary, a small hand rake lay where someone had left it for convenience, likely the visitor with the basket, or perhaps someone else with whom they had shared the secret. The traveler took it up and used it to ease a patch where the soil had crusted in the sun. The rake's teeth combed through with the same sensation as combing hair that has been wind-tossed. They felt the satisfaction of a small rightness accomplished. A child's laugh came from the lane, and then the visitor's voice, followed by the child's smaller steps, stopping and starting in their own rhythm, unashamed of their disobedience to straight lines. The traveler stood and waved. The child blinked and then smiled back, making the sort of one-sided grin that children make when they know they are safe. The three of them spent a little while together. The visitor showed the child how to pinch a stem of mint and then smell their fingers. And the child did it and looked at their hand as if it were magic, which in that moment it was. The traveler taught the child how to watch a snail without disturbing it, and the child, to everyone's surprise, sat very still to do it. They harvested a handful of peas. The child held one up to their ear like a shell, listening for the ocean, and declared that peas whisper, and the visitor and the traveler agreed that this was true, and perhaps always had been, though no one had named it before. They ate peas together, raw and sweet, and shared the satisfaction of the garden, not as a marvel, though it was, not as something to be possessed, though it could be cared for, but as something in the world that exists for itself and is yet made richer by being shared with others. That, perhaps, was the garden's deepest gift, a sense that one can belong to a place and not own it, can care for it and not ask it to confess to only you. When the sun bent low and the child began to sway with that irresistible fatigue that says that clouds should be beds and the day should be a blanket, the visitor squeezed the traveler's shoulder. "We'll be by again," they said. "There is soap to be made with rosemary and a pie to be made with quince. Time keeps us well stocked." "Time keeps gardens," the traveler said, and they both understood that in a way that did not need more words. The child waved an imprecise hand, half-hearted and endearing, the way children wave when they are about to fall asleep on their feet. And then they were gone. The traveler sat a while longer. It was enough to breathe. The world met them with a quiet that seemed to fit in the shape of their own quiet. They felt the day's edges soften and then dissolve, like sugar in warm water. The herbs released their evening perfume, as if in thanks for the sun. Somewhere, again, a night insect counted time, a slow, steady clock. No one needed to wind. A bat zigged and zagged against a sky that had gathered its first fin stars. The traveler lay down once more on their cloak and felt, as they closed their eyes, the certainty that they would be rested, because everything around them was resting in its way. They slept, and in their sleep, they walked their hands through soil that had always been there for them, and they walked their heart through rooms that had always existed, but had waited for them to open the door. The garden thrived, not in the way of careful showpieces, not with measured rows and exacting borders, but with the sure, restful, mutual reliance of things that share a small place and make it entire. The traveler breathed with it. Their breath made a small part of the garden's air, and the garden's air made a small part of the traveler's breath. In the morning that followed, the traveler knew with the soft sort of knowing that is not a plan, that they would go again soon, not from impatience, not from discomfort, from the understanding that staying, when done too long, can unbalance the sort of love this place inspired. Better to leave while the heart is full and return when it can be filled again. They sat on the bench a while and let themselves be filled. They looked at their hands. There were lines of time's soft green pressed into the skin where they had handled stems. There was a faint brown under the nail that said soil. There was a small scratch from a rose that said, "Beauty sometimes has edges that ask to be learned." They liked what these told them. They felt warmed by the idea that the garden would continue without them, that their absence was not a vacancy, but a space into which other care could flow. They stood, and out of habit, straightened one of the stakes, wiping the top with their thumb. In pencil they wrote on it a simple word, "Welcome." It felt right to leave a message not to the plants, who needed no invitation, but to the people who might come in through the honeysuckle, uncertain and hoping. If a person could be made quiet by a single word, this might be that word. Before they left, they tucked a few extra seeds under the low lip of a stone near the rosemary, wrapped in the dry curl of a leaf and bound by a loop of twine. They thought of them as a gift to the visitor, or to a future finding, or to whoever might look at exactly that moment and feel the small pull of treasure. They touched the quince's bark and the grain of the bench. They breathed and felt themselves breathed by the place, a reciprocal action that is easier than people remember. Then they stepped through the green and back onto the lane, which now felt almost like a hallway leading from one room to another, each room carrying the same air of soft enough safety. They went on, slow as they pleased. The line of their movement through the world would lead them new places, each with its own herbs, its own birds. The hidden garden stayed where it was, inexhaustible in its smallness, abundant in its soft light. It would keep welcoming and keep growing whether anyone looked or not. For that is the gentle secret of things that thrive. They do not require witness to be real, but they offer themselves easily to those who choose to witness. In the truest sense, the traveler carried the garden without lifting it, and the garden carried the traveler without moving. There was no burden in this, only a shared, quiet agreement that care makes rooms in the heart and the world where beings can rest. That night, miles away in a different patch of trees, under a different spread of sky, the traveler lay down and closed their eyes and felt the familiar soft weight settle over them. The kind of comfort one receives when one knows that some places are thriving, held by simple acts and left open to the kind of goodness that needs no explanation. In such knowledge, the body lets go. In such knowledge, sleep arrives kindly, like a friend who warms your hands and does not mind that you have nothing urgent to say. And the hidden garden, full of fragrant herbs and soft light, continued to hum. The bees measured their days. The wren stitched morning to evening with its neat song. The peas climbed and breathed. The rosemary kept its internal sea. Nothing hurried. Everything belonged. The garden wore time the way a shawl is worn by someone sitting on a porch at dusk, lightly, without fuss, perfectly fitting. And the traveler, wherever they went, could bring that shawl to their shoulders in memory and sit quietly within it and find that, no matter what the day had asked of them, there was always a corner of green, always a soft bench, always a small ecosystem, thriving, within and without, ready to receive them, to ease them gently, and to let them rest. That was the end of the story. Thank you for listening. I hope it brought you calm, comfort, and a little peace. Remember, you can always return to our channel whenever you need a moment to relax and unwind. If you enjoyed this tale, consider liking and subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take a deep breath, let go, and carry this sense of calm with you.